I didn't faint. I didn't scream. I didn't fall to the floor. That's important because if I had, people would have believed me immediately. But hypoglycemia doesn't always give you a dramatic moment. Sometimes it just quietly dismantles you while everyone around assumes you're fine, or worse, pretending. I was standing at the checkout counter of a grocery store on an ordinary afternoon when the register froze and the line stopped moving. Nothing unusual, no emergency, just a delay. And that's when my body started turning against me. At first it was subtle, a light tremor in my fingers, a strange pressure behind my eyes, the kind of feeling you can almost talk yourself out of if you try hard enough. I told myself I was okay. I told myself I'd eaten earlier. I told myself I just needed to pay and get out. But then my hands began to shake more noticeably, not from nerves, not from fear, but from something deeper, something chemical. My blood sugar was dropping, and it was dropping fast. I tightened my grip on the basket, trying to steady myself. The fluorescent lights felt brighter than they should have. The sounds around me, beeping scanners, carts rolling, voices overlapping, started to blur together. I knew what was happening. I've lived with it long enough to recognize the signs. Hypoglycemia doesn't announce itself with pain. It announces itself with confusion, with weakness, with the slow loss of control over things you normally don't think about, like standing, speaking, focusing. I looked toward the shelves near the checkout. Candy bars, bottles of juice, sugar. I needed sugar immediately. Not in 10 minutes. Not after an explanation. Not after permission. I needed it now. So I did the most reasonable thing I could think of. I stepped out of line, calmly, carefully, and reached for a small bottle of orange juice from the cooler beside the register. That's when I heard her. Oh no, absolutely not. Her voice came from directly behind me, sharp, confident, annoyed. I turned my head slightly, already feeling the fog in my mind thickening. She was standing there with her arms crossed, lips tight, eyes fixed on the bottle in my hand. She looked like someone who had already decided I was a problem before I ever opened my mouth. "You can't do that," she said. "You don't just grab stuff because you feel like it." "I need sugar," I replied. At least that's what I meant to say. The words came out slower than I wanted them to. My tongue felt heavy. "My blood sugar is low." She laughed. Not nervously. Not awkwardly. She laughed like someone who'd just caught a stranger trying to pull a cheap trick. "Sure it is," she said. "That's the excuse now?" I tried to twist the cap off the bottle, but my fingers fumbled. The shaking had spread from my hands into my arms. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, loud and uneven. "I'm not stealing," I said. "I'll pay. I just need—" She cut me off immediately. "No. You don't get special treatment because you decide to fake a medical emergency." Fake. That word landed harder than anything else she'd said. People started paying attention. I could feel it without looking, the shift in energy, the subtle lean of bodies, the curiosity, the judgment, the assumption that something dishonest was happening. The cashier looked up from the frozen register, irritation already on her face. "Ma'am," she said to me, "you'll have to wait until the system's back up." "I can't wait," I said, my voice unsteady now. "I have hypoglycemia." The woman behind me shook her head slowly, like she was disappointed in humanity itself. "She can't even talk straight," she said loudly. "That's not hypoglycemia, that's acting." My vision narrowed slightly at the edges. The floor felt unstable, like it had shifted just enough to throw off my balance. I grabbed the edge of the counter without thinking, my knuckles whitening. "Please," I said. I hated how small that word sounded. That's when she said it. Calmly, clearly, loud. Enough for everyone to hear. "I don't believe you." Not, "I'm not sure." Not, "Maybe you should get help." Just a flat accusation. a verdict. The word believe mattered, because once someone decides they don't believe you, nothing you say after that sounds true. She turned toward the cashier. "This is a scam," she said. "She's trying to steal by pretending to be sick." The word steal changed everything. Now it wasn't about health. It wasn't about confusion. It wasn't about someone struggling in public. It was about wrongdoing. I shook my head slowly. "I'm not pretending," I said, but my speech betrayed me again, dragging, uneven, exactly the way hypoglycemia makes it. The woman smiled. Not kindly, not sympathetically. It was the smile of someone who feels morally superior, someone who believes they're protecting the rules from people who don't deserve leniency. "I'm calling security," she announced. A few people murmured. Someone behind her sighed. I saw a phone lift slightly out of the corner of my eye. I felt weaker, not collapsing, just fading, like my body was slowly unplugging. When the security guard arrived, he didn't ask how I was feeling. He didn't ask what I needed. He looked at the bottle in my hand, then at the woman, then back at me. "She says you're trying to steal," he said. "I need sugar," I replied. My blood sugar dropped. The guard frowned. "You can't open merchandise without paying." "I wasn't—" "She's lying," the woman said instantly. "Look at her. She's clearly faking it." The guard studied me again, my shaking hands, my uneven breathing, my grip on the counter, and I could see the moment his mind made a decision. He wasn't seeing a medical issue. He was seeing a disturbance. That's when I realized something terrifying. If no one believed me, this could go very wrong. And the worst part? There was a camera directly above the checkout counter, recording everything. Every second, every word, every movement. If stories like this matter to you, stories where invisible conditions are dismissed until the truth can't be ignored, stay with me. You don't have to do anything else. Just keep listening. Because what happened next changed everything. The security guard didn't touch me, not at first. He just stood there, close enough to block my movement, far enough to keep his hands clean if things escalated. I noticed that immediately. When you're hypoglycemic, your brain doesn't shut off all at once. It prioritizes strange things. Body, language, tone, threat. I could feel my legs getting weaker, not collapsing, just unreliable, like they belonged to someone else. The woman crossed her arms again, satisfied now. She'd done her part. She'd identified the problem. Me. "Ma'am," the guard said, his voice flat, rehearsed, "you need to put the bottle down." I looked at the orange juice in my hand. It felt heavier than it should have. My fingers were numb, like they'd been dipped in ice water. "I need it," I said. "I'll pay. I just can't wait." "You can't consume unpaid items," he repeated, slower this time, as if speaking to a child or someone who didn't understand basic rules. The woman nodded along. "Exactly. That's what I told her. Everyone has to follow the rules." Rules. That word again. Rules always sound reasonable when you're not the one whose body is failing in public. I tried to shift my weight off the counter and nearly lost my balance. I caught myself just in time, but it wasn't graceful. Someone behind the woman inhaled sharply. I heard a whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. I knew what they were thinking. Drunk, high, lying, acting. "I have hypoglycemia," I said again. Saying it felt useless now, like repeating a word in a language no one else spoke. "This happens if my blood sugar drops." The guard exhaled through his nose. "Do you have proof of that?" Proof. I almost laughed, but my body didn't have the energy. Proof of a chemical imbalance happening inside me, right? Now, in real time, while my hands shook and my vision blurred. What kind of proof did he expect? A doctor's note? A lab report? My medical history printed out and laminated? I started, then stopped. My thoughts scattered. I couldn't remember where my wallet was for a second. That scared me more than anything else so far. The woman seized the silence. "See?" she said loudly. "She can't even answer. She's making it up as she goes." The cashier had stopped pretending to fix the register. She was watching now, eyes darting between me and the guard, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to contradict him. Another employee hovered a few feet away, pretending to straighten candy bars while listening to every word. "Do you need medical assistance?" the guard asked, but his tone didn't match the question. It wasn't concern, it was a formality, a checkbox. "I need sugar," I said. "That's it. I just need sugar." "You can't drink that without paying," he replied. The circle closed in tighter, not physically, but socially. Everyone had picked a side, even if they didn't realize it. And once a group decides someone is a problem, everything that person does becomes suspicious. My shaking wasn't seen as a symptom anymore. It was seen as performance. The woman leaned closer, lowering her voice, but not enough. "You should be ashamed," she said. "People with real medical issues don't behave like this." That one hurt more than the rest, because it wasn't just an accusation. It was erasure. She wasn't just calling me a liar. She was deciding who was allowed to be sick and who wasn't. The guard reached for the bottle. "Give it to me," he said. My fingers tightened reflexively, not because I wanted to resist him, but because my body understood something my brain barely could. If I let go of the sugar, I might not stay standing much longer. The room felt distant now, like I was underwater. Sounds were muffled. Lights too bright. My heartbeat irregular, fluttering in my chest. "I can't," I said. "Please." That word again. Please. I hated it. I hated how often I'd said it in the last few minutes. The guard misread it, or maybe he didn't care to read it at all. "Ma'am," he said, more firmly now, "if you don't comply, I'll have to escort you out. Out. Away from the juice, away from help, away from witnesses." The woman smiled again, small and tight. This was exactly how she'd imagined it ending. I felt a wave of heat wash over me, followed immediately by cold. My knees buckled slightly. I leaned harder into the counter, my shoulder pressing against it now. The cashier flinched. "She's doing it again," the woman said quickly. "See, she's pretending to get worse." "I'm not pretending," I said, but my voice cracked, not emotionally, physically. My throat felt dry. My mouth tasted metallic. The guard looked uncertain for the first time. Not sympathetic, just unsure. Situations like this aren't covered cleanly in training manuals. There's a gap between theft and medical emergency, and that gap is where people like me fall through. "Should we call an ambulance?" the cashier asked quietly. The woman scoffed. "For what? So she can really sell the act?" I wanted to scream. Instead, I slid down slightly, ending up half sitting, half leaning against the counter. Someone gasped. Someone else stepped back. That's when a man a few spots down the line spoke up. "She doesn't look okay," he said. Not loudly, not dramatically, just stating an obvious fact. The woman rounded on him instantly. "Oh, so now you're a doctor too?" The guard raised a hand. "Sir, please don't get involved." The man shrugged, backing off. And just like that, the moment of support disappeared. That's how fragile it is. One sentence, one glance from authority, and everyone retreats. My head was pounding now. Not pain exactly, pressure, like something was squeezing my brain from the inside. I tried to focus on the juice label. Orange, vitamin C, sugar. The words blurred. The guard spoke into his radio. "Manager to check out 3, he said. "Possible theft situation." Possible theft, not possible medical emergency. Not customer in distress, theft. The word echoed in my head, slow and heavy. The woman straightened, pleased. She adjusted her jacket, already preparing for the outcome she'd imagined. I could tell she'd rehearsed this scenario in her head before. The heroic customer, the liar exposed, the rules upheld. My breathing became shallow. I counted my breaths the way I'd been taught. In, out, in, out. It didn't help. Without glucose, coping strategies are just noise. The manager arrived a minute later, maybe two. Time had started stretching in strange ways. He looked tired, annoyed, like this was the last thing he needed on his shift. "What's going on?" he asked. The woman answered before anyone else could. "This woman tried to steal a drink by pretending to have a medical emergency." I opened my mouth to correct her. Nothing came out. The manager looked at me, then at the guard, then at the bottle. "Is that true?" "I have hypoglycemia," I said, forcing the words out carefully. "I needed sugar." The manager's eyebrows knit together. "Do you have documentation?" Again with the proof. Again with the assumption that sickness only counts if it comes with paperwork. "I don't carry my medical records to the grocery store," I said, or tried to. It came out slower than I wanted. The woman laughed softly. "Convenient." The manager sighed. "You can't open?" "Merchandise. Without paying," he said, echoing the guard's words. "That's policy." Policy, rules, procedure, all perfectly reasonable words, stacked neatly on top of a person who was barely holding it together. My vision darkened at the edges. I could feel my pulse in my throat now. Loud, irregular. I slid a little further down, my back pressed against the counter. "That's enough," the guard said, stepping closer. "Ma'am, you need to stand up." "I can't," I said. "I'm trying." The woman shook her head dramatically. "Unbelievable." That's when someone behind the register said, "We should check the cameras." The room went quiet. Not completely silent, but close enough that I noticed the absence of voices. The woman turned sharply. "Why?" she asked too quickly. The manager hesitated. He glanced up toward the ceiling, toward the black dome mounted directly above the checkout area. The camera that had been there the whole time, watching without emotion, without judgment. "Just to be safe," he said. The woman scoffed, but there was a flicker of something else there now. Uncertainty. "Fine," she said. "Go ahead. You'll see exactly what I said." The guard nodded. "I'll pull the footage." As he walked away, my body sagged in relief and fear at the same time. Relief because something might finally change. Fear because if they didn't see what I hoped they'd see, I didn't know how much longer I could stay conscious. I stared at the camera above me, blinking slowly, fighting to stay present. It had been recording everything. From the moment the line stopped. From the moment my hands began to shake. From the moment she decided I was lying. And for the first time since this started, I thought maybe I wouldn't have to convince anyone with words. Because the truth doesn't slur, it doesn't shake, and it doesn't need permission to exist. While the security guard walked away to pull the footage, nothing got easier. People assume that once someone says, "Check the cameras," the tension disappears. It doesn't. It just changes shape. The accusations don't stop. The weakness doesn't pause. Your body doesn't wait politely for the truth to be reviewed. Hypoglycemia doesn't care about procedures or fairness. It keeps moving, steadily, quietly, stripping pieces of you away. I stayed half-slumped against the counter, my shoulder pressed into the cold metal edge. Sitting fully on the floor felt dangerous, like a point of no return. Standing felt impossible. So I stayed in, between, suspended in that humiliating middle ground where you're not collapsed enough to be taken seriously and not functional enough to defend yourself. The manager stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching me with the expression of someone waiting for clarity, not someone concerned for a human being. The woman stayed close, too close, like she was afraid the truth might escape if she stepped back. "See?" she said to the manager, gesturing toward me. "She's still putting on a show." I tried to respond, but my mouth wouldn't form the words quickly enough. Everything felt delayed. Thought first, then intention, then action, each one lagging behind the other. My tongue felt thick, my lips dry. I swallowed and tasted metal again. "I'm not putting on anything," I said slowly. "I'm getting worse." She rolled her eyes. "Of course you are." The cashier shifted her weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable now. "Maybe she should sit," she said quietly. "She already is." The woman snapped. "That's part of the act." The word act echoed in my head. Act, performance, pretending. I wanted to scream that my body didn't have the energy for deception, that lying takes coordination and clarity I didn't have. But all I could do was breathe and try to stay conscious. My hands trembled uncontrollably now, not just shaking but jerking slightly, my fingers twitching as if they belonged to someone else. Time stretched. Every second felt heavy. The lights buzzed overhead too, loud, too sharp. Someone nearby coughed. A cart squeaked as it rolled past. Ordinary sounds felt intrusive, almost painful, like my senses had lost their filters. The woman leaned closer again. "You know what really bothers me," she said, loud enough for the people around us to hear. "People who fake this kind of thing make it harder for people with real problems." I stared at her, trying to focus my eyes. Her face blurred at the edges. She looked so sure of herself, so convinced. That certainty was what hurt the most. Not just that she was wrong, but that she was comfortable being wrong. Comfortable humiliating a stranger because it made her feel righteous. "I have a real problem," I said, forcing the words out one by one. "You just can't see it." She laughed again. "That's convenient." The manager cleared his throat. "Let's just wait for the footage," he said, though his tone suggested impatience more than neutrality. Waiting was agony. Waiting meant my body continued to spiral while everyone else stood still. My heart fluttered irregularly, skipping beats, then racing. My vision pulsed in time with it, darkening, then sharpening, like a faulty camera lens. I focused on the floor tiles, counting them, trying to anchor myself in something concrete. Someone in the crowd whispered, "She doesn't look good." Another voice responded, "Yeah, but people fake stuff all the time." That was the problem. They didn't need certainty. Suspicion was enough. Doubt was enough. Once doubt took root, empathy dried up. The woman straightened suddenly. "If she passes out, that's on her," she said. "We warned her." Warned me of what? That my body would fail me in public? That no one would believe me until it was too late? The logic was cruel and circular. I was responsible for my symptoms, and my symptoms were proof of my guilt. The manager glanced at his watch. "He should be back any second," he said. I nodded faintly, not because I understood, but because nodding felt easier than speaking. My head felt too heavy to hold upright. I rested it briefly against the counter, closing my eyes for half a second. "Hey," the cashier said softly. "Stay with me." The woman scoffed. "Don't encourage her." I opened my eyes again, forcing myself to stay present. I knew what slipping away felt like. I'd experienced it before. That slow fade where the world narrows and sounds stretch and your thoughts scatter like leaves in wind. I couldn't let that happen here. Not like this. Not while they were still deciding whether I deserved help. The security guard returned, his expression different now, less rigid, less certain. He motioned to the manager. "I've got the footage," he said. You should see this. The woman smiled, relieved. Good, she said. Then we can end this. The manager followed the guard toward the back office, disappearing from view. The crowd murmured. A few people leaned in, craning their necks, as if they could somehow see the screen from where they stood. I was left there, alone in the center of it all, my fate playing out somewhere behind a closed door. The minutes dragged. My breathing grew shallow again. I could feel sweat pooling under my arms, down my back. My shirt clung uncomfortably to my skin. I wiped my forehead with the back of my hand and noticed how pale it looked, almost gray. The woman watched me closely now, her confidence faltering just a fraction. If you're really sick, she said, softer than before, you should have said something sooner. I laughed weakly. I did, she frowned. You should have said it better. That sentence summed everything up. The burden was on me to communicate perfectly while my body actively prevented me from doing so. My failure to perform my illness correctly was being used as evidence that it wasn't real. The cashier handed me a small paper cup of water. Just sip, she said quietly, glancing toward where the manager had gone. I took it with shaking hands and drank slowly. Water wouldn't fix this, but it helped my throat, helped me breathe. Don't give her anything, the woman snapped. You're just enabling this. The cashier ignored her. A few seconds later, the manager and the guard reappeared. The manager's face had changed. The irritation was gone. In its place was something tighter, more serious. He didn't look at the woman right away. He looked at me. Ma'am, he said, how long have you had hypoglycemia? The question hit me like a wave. Not because it was aggressive, but because it was the first time anyone had asked me something real. Years, I said. It's managed, but sometimes it drops fast. The woman stiffened. What does that matter? She asked. She still tried to steal. The manager held up a hand. That's not what the footage shows. The store went quiet. Not a dramatic silence, a cautious one. The kind that falls when people realize the story they've been telling themselves might be wrong. The woman laughed nervously. What footage? She clearly... The manager cut her off. The video shows her standing in line for several minutes before the register issue. You can see her hands start shaking before she leaves the line. You can see her reach for the juice and attempt to explain herself before you confront her. The woman's face flushed. Well, that doesn't prove anything. The manager continued, his voice steady. It also shows that she didn't open the bottle until after you accused her of stealing. A murmur rippled through the crowd. That's not... The woman started. And, the manager added, it shows that you escalated the situation before any merchandise was consumed. The woman looked around, searching for support. The eyes that had been watching me now turned toward her. Some curious, some skeptical, some uncomfortable. She was slurring, the woman said quickly. She looked drunk. That can be a symptom of hypoglycemia, the manager replied. We confirmed that with our medical protocol. The guard shifted uncomfortably beside him. I was just trying to help, the woman said, her voice tight. The manager nodded. I understand, but accusing someone publicly of theft without evidence is not helping. The words hung there, heavy. I felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion wash over me. Not triumph, not satisfaction, just the easing of pressure, like someone had finally taken their foot off my chest. The manager turned fully toward me now. I'm sorry this happened, he said. We should have handled this differently. The woman's mouth opened and closed. So that's it? She asked. She gets away with it? The manager's expression hardened. There was no theft. The crowd shifted again. Someone cleared their throat. Another person quietly put their phone away. The guard looked at me, avoiding eye contact. Do you need medical assistance? He asked again, But this time the question sounded different. This time it carried weight. "Yes," I said. "And sugar." The manager nodded immediately. "Get her something." "On us." The woman scoffed, but the sound was hollow now. She had lost control of the narrative, and she knew it. As an employee rushed to grab a drink and a chair, I finally let myself sit fully, my legs no longer able to hold me. The floor felt cold beneath me, grounding. I took the juice when it was handed to me and drank slowly, carefully, letting the sugar do what words couldn't. The woman stood there for a moment longer, arms crossed, jaw tight. Then she turned away, muttering something under her breath. No one stopped her. No one followed her. But no one looked at her the same way either. As my blood sugar began to rise and the fog in my head slowly lifted, one thought repeated itself over and over again. If there hadn't been a camera, none of this would have mattered. I would have just been another person accused, dismissed, and left to deal with the consequences alone. And that realization stayed with me long after the shaking stopped. The sugar didn't work instantly. That's another thing people misunderstand. They think you drink something sweet and everything snaps back to normal, like flipping a switch. It doesn't. It creeps back slowly, unevenly, leaving you stranded in this strange in-between state where your body starts to recover, but your mind is still foggy, still raw, still processing the damage. I sat there on the floor for a few minutes, back against the counter, the cold seeping through my clothes, my hands wrapped tightly around the bottle like it might disappear if I let go. People avoided looking at me now, not out of kindness, but discomfort. It's easier to accuse someone than it is to sit with the fact that you were wrong. The same eyes that had been sharp and judgmental minutes earlier now slid away quickly when they caught mine. The crowd thinned. Carts rolled forward. The line resumed as if nothing had happened. Life moved on. It always does. The manager crouched a few feet away, keeping his distance but not walking off. "Take your time," he said. "There's no rush." That was the first genuinely human thing anyone had said to me since this started. I nodded slightly, still afraid that if I spoke too much, my words would tangle again. The cashier handed me a chair and helped me up slowly, carefully, like she was afraid I might break. The woman was still there. She hadn't left yet. She stood near the end of the checkout area, arms crossed tightly, staring at her phone without really looking at it. Every few seconds, she glanced up, checking to see if anyone was watching her. No one was, and that seemed to bother her more than being confronted. I drank more of the juice, slowly, deliberately, focusing on the taste. Sweet, sharp, real. My hands shook less now, though they still trembled faintly. My heartbeat began to steady, no longer racing unpredictably. The fog in my head started to thin, not enough to feel normal, but enough to think clearly again. And with clarity came the aftermath. The humiliation didn't, disappear with the symptoms. If anything, it grew sharper. Now that my body was no longer fighting for survival, my mind replayed everything that had happened. Every word, every look, every moment when I'd been reduced to a problem instead of a person. The way the woman had spoken about me, the way the guard had looked at me, the way the crowd had decided who I was without knowing anything about me. The manager stood and turned toward the woman. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I need to speak with you." She looked up, startled, then forced a smile. "About what?" "About your behavior," he replied. Her smile vanished. "Excuse me?" "You accused another customer of theft without evidence," he said. "You escalated the situation and caused a disruption." "I was trying to help," she snapped. "You saw the footage. She looked suspicious." The manager didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "The footage shows that you initiated the confrontation," he said, "and that your accusation was unfounded. So what? She shot back. People lie all the time. A few nearby customers slowed, pretending to check their receipts while listening. The woman noticed. Her posture stiffened. That may be, the manager said, but making public accusations like that is not acceptable here. She scoffed. So I'm being punished for speaking up? No, he replied. You're being addressed for how you spoke. The distinction mattered, and she hated it. This is ridiculous, she said. She embarrassed herself. Don't put this on me. I sat there silently, listening. Part of me wanted to disappear. Another part wanted to stand up and say something, anything, now that my voice would actually cooperate. But I stayed quiet. I didn't trust myself not to unravel again. The manager continued. I'm issuing a formal warning, he said. If there's another incident like this, you will be asked not to return. Her eyes widened. You can't be serious. I am, he said. She laughed, sharp and disbelieving. So, she gets free juice and I get threatened? This isn't about the juice, he said. It's about conduct. She opened her mouth to argue again, then stopped. She looked around and realized something crucial. The crowd wasn't on her side anymore. No one nodded. No one murmured agreement. No one defended her. The social current had shifted, and she was suddenly swimming against it. She grabbed her bag, muttering under her breath. Unbelievable, she said. Absolutely unbelievable. As she walked away, I felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction, not revenge, just emptiness. The damage was already done. Her consequences didn't erase the minutes I'd spent fighting to stay conscious while being accused of lying. The guard approached me again, slower this time. I'm sorry, he said quietly. He didn't meet my eyes. We should have handled that differently. I nodded. I wasn't ready to forgive him yet. Apologies land differently when they come after proof instead of trust. You need an ambulance? He asked. I shook my head. No, I just need to sit for a bit. Take all the time you need, the manager said. And I'm sorry too. I looked up at him. If there hadn't been a camera, I said, my voice steadier now, would this have gone the same way? He didn't answer right away. He didn't lie either. I don't know, he said finally. That honesty mattered more than reassurance. I sat there for several more minutes, drinking slowly, breathing carefully, letting my body recalibrate. The store noise faded back into the background. The cashier returned to her register. The guard went back to his post. Normalcy reasserted itself, indifferent and efficient. Eventually, I stood. My legs were still weak, but they held. I paid for my groceries at a different register, quietly, without incident. The cashier avoided my eyes, not unkindly, just unsure of what to say. As I walked toward the exit, I glanced up at the camera above the checkout one last time. A small, black dome. Unremarkable. Easy to ignore. Yet it had been the only thing in that room that hadn't judged me. It hadn't assumed. It hadn't needed convincing. It had simply recorded. Outside, the air felt different, cooler, sharper. I stood there for a moment, leaning against the brick wall, grounding myself. Cars passed. Someone laughed nearby. Life continued, untouched by what had just happened inside that store. But I wasn't untouched. I thought about how easily it could have ended differently. How a few more minutes without sugar could have turned confusion into collapse. How quickly suspicion had replaced compassion. How fragile credibility is when your condition doesn't announce itself in visible ways. Invisible doesn't mean rare. It doesn't mean mild. And it certainly doesn't mean fake. I got into my car and sat there for a while before starting the engine, hands resting on the steering wheel, breathing slowly. My reflection in the windshield looked tired, older somehow, I knew this. Wouldn't be the last time something like this happened. Maybe not this extreme, maybe not this public. But doubt follows people like me everywhere. In stores, at work, on public transport, in places where help depends on belief. And next time, there might not be a camera. That thought stayed with me long after I drove away. I thought it was over when I left the store. That's what you want to believe in moments like that. You want to think the humiliation stays behind, trapped between checkout, counters, and fluorescent lights. But it doesn't. It follows you. It settles into your chest and shows up later, when your body is calm enough for your mind to replay everything it didn't have time to process before. I sat in my car for a long time with the engine off. My hands rested on the steering wheel, still slightly unsteady, my fingers tapping absent-mindedly as if they were relearning how to belong to me. The juice had helped. The fog had lifted enough for me to feel present again. But presence didn't bring relief. It brought awareness, and awareness brought the weight of what had happened. I kept seeing her face, the certainty, the ease with which she'd decided I was lying. It bothered me more than the accusation itself. People accuse each other of things all the time, but certainty like that, unearned, unexamined, does something deeper. It tells you that no explanation would have mattered. She hadn't been looking for the truth. She'd been looking for confirmation of a story she already believed. I started the car and pulled out of the parking lot slowly. My body still a little sluggish. My reactions dulled. Traffic felt louder than usual, horns too sharp, sunlight too bright. I rolled the window down just to feel the air, to remind myself that I was still here, still functioning. At the first red light, my phone buzzed. I almost ignored it. Then it buzzed again. I glanced down. A text from an unknown number. "Is this you?" There was a link attached. My stomach tightened. I knew before I opened it. I shouldn't have clicked. Part of me knew that, but curiosity and dread are powerful together. I tapped the screen. It was a video, shaky, vertical, filmed from behind the candy display near the checkout. The angle was bad, the audio worse. But it was clear enough, too clear. There I was, half leaning against the counter, hands shaking, voice uneven. There she was, loud and confident, accusing me of faking it. There was the guard, standing between us. There was the moment someone said, "stealing." There was the part where my knees buckled and someone gasped. The caption read, "Woman fakes medical emergency to steal juice?" My throat went dry. I scrolled. Dozens of comments already. Looks drunk. People will do anything for attention. Why didn't she just pay? Another scammer. I felt sick. The video cut off before the manager came back, before the cameras were checked, before the truth surfaced. It ended right at the moment that made me look the worst, the moment without context. That's how fast it spreads. That's how incomplete stories become permanent damage. People don't wait for resolution. They don't look for updates. They react to what fits their assumptions and move on. My phone buzzed again. Another message. "They're saying some awful stuff." I pulled into a side street and parked, my heart pounding again, not from hypoglycemia this time, but from something colder and heavier. I refreshed the page. More comments. She should be banned. This is why prices are so high. Disgusting behavior. No one mentioned hypoglycemia. No one mentioned invisible conditions. No one asked what actually happened. Why would they? The video told them everything they thought they needed to know. I closed the app and stared straight ahead, my reflection faint in the windshield. My hands clenched into fists. Not anger yet. Something else. A sense of exposure, of being stripped down and displayed without consent. I thought about the camera inside the store. The one that had saved me there, the one that had told the full story. And then I thought about how that footage wasn't public. It belonged to the store, not to me. The narrative online was already forming without it. I drove home in silence. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I tried to eat something. I tried to rest. I tried not to open my phone every 5 minutes. But my mind kept circling back to the same thought. What if this follows me? What if someone recognizes me? What if my employer sees it? What if the version of the story without the truth becomes the only version people remember? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard her voice again. I don't believe you. I heard the word steal. I saw the way the crowd had leaned in, hungry for a spectacle. Around 2 in the morning, I checked my phone again. The video had thousands of views now. Some comments had shifted. A few people were questioning it. Why is she shaking like that? That doesn't look fake. Could be low blood sugar. Others doubled down. Always an excuse. Funny how there's always a condition. I put the phone face down on the table and pressed my palms against my eyes. This is what people don't understand about invisible conditions. Even when you survive the moment, you still have to survive the aftermath, the explanations, the disbelief, the public judgment from people who were never there and never will be. The next morning, I woke up to an email from the store. It was from the manager. He apologized again, formally this time. He explained that they were aware of a video circulating online and that the store had requested its removal. He said they were reviewing internal procedures. He asked if I was okay. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. I'm alive, I wrote. But that doesn't mean this didn't do damage. He responded a few minutes later. We have the footage. If you need it, let us know. That sentence stopped me. If you need it. For the first time since this started, something shifted. The truth existed, fully, clearly, recorded from multiple angles, with timestamps, with audio, with context. It wasn't public yet, but it could be. I didn't reply right away. I thought about the comments, the assumptions, the certainty of strangers who didn't know me. I thought about how easily a lie or an incomplete truth could harden into fact if no one challenged it. I wasn't looking for revenge. I didn't want attention. I just wanted the truth to exist in the same space as the accusation. That afternoon, I replied. Yes, I wrote. I need it. The response came quickly. We'll send it. I put the phone down and sat back, my heart beating faster now, but not with fear, with resolve. If people were going to judge me, they were going to do it with the full story in front of them, and this time the camera wasn't going to be on the wrong side. The file arrived the next morning. No dramatic subject line, no warning. Just a simple email with an attachment and a short sentence underneath. This is the full footage from Checkout 3. I stared at the screen longer than I needed to. There's a strange fear that comes with seeing yourself from the outside, especially in a moment when you weren't in control. I knew what I'd feel when I watched it. I knew it would be uncomfortable, but I also knew I couldn't not watch it. The truth only helps if you're willing to face it yourself first. I opened the video. It started earlier than I expected, several minutes before anything went wrong. There I was, standing in line, normal posture, normal movements, no shaking, no slurring, just waiting. The timestamp rolled calmly in the corner. The register froze. The cashier frowned. A customer complained. The line stalled. Then, slowly, I changed. Not in the way people online imagined, not sudden, not theatrical. The shaking crept in almost invisibly. A subtle shift of weight, a hand, gripping the basket tighter, a breath taken too quickly. If you didn't know what hypoglycemia looked like, you'd miss it completely. But once you did know, it was obvious. I watched myself glance toward the shelves. I watched myself hesitate before stepping out of line. I watched how carefully I moved, how I didn't rush, didn't push, didn't cause a scene. Then she appeared in frame. The moment she spoke, the energy changed. Even on silent playback, you could see it. Her body language shifted, from passive to aggressive instantly. Leaning forward, chin raised, finger lifting slightly as if she were already preparing to point. I turned the sound on. Hearing it again was worse. The certainty in her voice, the casual way she dismissed me, the laughter, the accusation. It all sounded harsher than I remembered. Maybe because I wasn't fighting to stay conscious anymore. Maybe because distance makes cruelty clearer. The camera caught everything she said, everything I said, every time I tried to explain and failed. Every time she talked over me, every glance from the cashier, every subtle reaction from the people around us. And then the word, steal. The timestamp showed it clearly. She said it before I ever opened the bottle, before I even twisted the cap, before anything that could reasonably be called suspicious. I paused the video and leaned back in my chair. This was it. This was the missing piece the online video didn't have, the thing no comment section had bothered to ask for. I kept watching. The arrival of the security guard, the way his posture immediately aligned with hers, the way he looked at the bottle first, not my face, the way his questions were framed, not as concern but as interrogation. I watched myself struggle to answer simple questions. I watched my mouth fail me. I watched my hands shake harder. I watched my knees bend slightly and my shoulder hit the counter. And I watched the crowd. That part surprised me the most. From the inside, it felt like everyone was staring. From the camera angle, it was more subtle. People glancing, then looking away. People half watching while pretending not to. Judgment without commitment. Suspicion without responsibility. The footage didn't dramatize anything. It didn't need to. Reality was enough. By the time the manager walked off to review the footage, I was visibly worse. Anyone who wanted to see it could see it. Anyone who didn't want to believe could still deny it. But denial would no longer be ignorance. It would be choice. I closed the video when it ended. My hands were steady now. My mind was clear. And I felt something I hadn't felt since this started. Control. Not over what had happened. That was done. But over what happened next. I checked the original video again. It was still up. Fewer comments now, but angrier. People had dug in. When doubt gets challenged, it often hardens. She planned it. Notice how she waits until people are watching. Still looks fake to me. I thought. About responding, typing explanations, posting links, defending myself line by line, then I stopped. Explanations invite debate. Debate invites dismissal. Evidence doesn't argue, it shows. I emailed the manager back. I thanked him. I asked one question. Am I allowed to share this footage? His reply came quickly. Yes. It's your incident. We'll blur faces if needed, but you're free to use it. I didn't need faces blurred. I needed truth. That afternoon, I uploaded the footage. No dramatic. Caption. No angry rant, no insults, just a short description. Full footage from the checkout counter. Judge for yourself. I didn't tag anyone. I didn't add commentary. I let the video speak. Then I closed my phone. I didn't watch the numbers climb. I didn't refresh the page every few minutes. I walked away and made myself something to eat, slow and careful, listening to my body in a way I hadn't earlier that day. When I checked again that evening, everything had changed. The comments were different now. Not all kind, not all apologetic, but different. Oh, that looks real. Why did the other video cut so much? She wasn't stealing. I didn't know low blood sugar looked like that. Some people doubled down, of course. They always do. But their voices were quieter now, drowned out by something stronger than opinion. Context. The original video was still up, but it didn't matter anymore. Anyone who found it also found mine. The story had two sides now, and one of them had timestamps. I scrolled slowly, reading without engaging. I wasn't looking for validation. I was watching something else happen. I was watching certainty dissolve. I was watching people reconsider assumptions they hadn't even known they'd made. A message popped up from someone I didn't know. "My sister has hypoglycemia. This happens to her all the time. Thank you for posting this." Another followed. "I judged you when I saw the first clip. I'm sorry." I stared at that one for a long time. Sorry didn't undo what happened. But it mattered. It meant the truth had reached someone before it was too late. Later that night, another message arrived. It was from the woman. Just one sentence. "You didn't have to ruin my life over this." I read it twice. Then I closed the app. Because that sentence told me everything I needed to know. She still didn't understand. She still thought accountability was punishment. She still believed the story was about her. It wasn't. It was about what happens when people decide disbelief is safer than compassion. When they assume the worst because it costs them nothing in the moment. When invisible conditions collide with public judgment. I didn't reply to her. I didn't need to. The camera already had. I thought that would be the end of it. Once the full footage was out, once the truth was visible, once people stopped arguing about whether I was lying or not, I expected the noise to fade. In some ways, it did. The worst of the accusations lost their fuel. The loudest voices moved on to the next outrage, but something else replaced them. Something quieter, heavier, and harder to ignore. Questions. People didn't just want to know what happened. They wanted to know why. Why the guard reacted the way he did. Why the cashier hesitated. Why the manager didn't step in sooner. Why one stranger's certainty had carried more weight than my explanation, my shaking hands, my obvious distress. And those questions didn't stay online. 2 days later, my phone rang while I was in the kitchen making breakfast. I almost didn't answer. I'd learned to be cautious with unknown numbers, but something told me this one mattered. It was the store's corporate office. They were polite, professional, measured. They said they were conducting an internal review. They said they had seen the footage, both mine and the clip that had circulated online. They said they wanted to understand how a situation involving a medical emergency had escalated into a public accusation of theft. They asked me to walk them through everything again. I told them exactly what I'd told everyone else. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't soften it either. I described the symptoms, the confusion, the fear. I described the moment I realized no one believed me. I described how dangerous that felt. There was a pause on the line when I finished. One of them cleared their throat. "We failed you," they said. I didn't know how to respond to that. I wasn't looking for an admission. I wasn't seeking an apology on a corporate level. But hearing those words, spoken plainly, did something unexpected. It released a tension I hadn't realized I was still holding. They told me changes were being made, new training, clearer protocols for medical situations that don't look obvious, emphasis on listening before accusing, on de-escalation, on understanding that not all emergencies look like emergencies. I thanked them and hung up. Afterward, I sat at the table for a long time, staring at my coffee as it went cold. It felt strange to know that something so personal, so humiliating, was now being discussed in meeting rooms by people who had never met me. But if that was the cost of making things slightly safer for the next person, I could live with it. Not everyone reacted that way. The woman didn't disappear quietly. She posted a lot. Long messages about being misunderstood, about cancel culture, about how she was only trying to stop theft, and had been vilified for doing the right thing. She never mentioned hypoglycemia. Never mentioned the footage. Never mentioned how quickly she'd decided I was lying. Some people believed her. They always do. There's comfort in siding with authority and certainty even when it's wrong. Others pushed back, linking the full video, pointing out details she conveniently ignored. The conversation wasn't kind anymore, and that's when I realized something important. The camera didn't just expose the truth, it removed her. Control over the story. That loss of control is what people like her fear most. Not accountability, not consequences, exposure. I didn't engage, I didn't comment, I didn't argue. I watched from a distance as the narrative continued without me at the center of it anymore. Instead, messages kept coming from people I didn't know. A father whose son had type 1 diabetes and had been accused of faking low blood sugar at school. A woman with epilepsy who'd been filmed during a seizure and mocked online. A man with panic disorder who'd been removed from a flight because he looked unstable. Different conditions, same pattern, disbelief first, humiliation second, proof demanded last. I read every message, slowly, carefully. Each one added weight to a realization that had been forming since the checkout line. This wasn't an isolated incident. It wasn't about one woman or one store or one misunderstanding. It was about how society treats anything it can't immediately see or categorize. We trust visuals. We trust confidence. We trust rules. We distrust confusion. We distrust weakness. We distrust anything that disrupts order without fitting a familiar script. Invisible conditions don't fit scripts. They don't announce themselves politely. They don't wait for permission. They don't perform in ways that make bystanders comfortable. That makes people uneasy. And uneasy people look for explanations that protect their sense of control. Sometimes that explanation is, "You're lying." A week later, the store sent me a follow-up email. The security guard had been reassigned temporarily for retraining. New guidelines had been distributed. They thanked me again for my patience and cooperation. Patience. I thought about how patient my body had been with me over the years. How many times I'd managed symptoms quietly, without asking anyone for anything. How much work went into appearing normal enough not to be questioned, and how quickly all of that disappeared the moment something went wrong in public. I went back to the store once, weeks later. Not out of necessity, out of curiosity. I wanted to know how it would feel. The same lights, the same checkout area, the same camera above the counter. No one recognized me. That was a relief. I paid. I left. Nothing happened. But as I walked out, I glanced back at the checkout line and imagined someone else standing there, hands shaking, words failing, looking for sugar while someone behind them decided they were lying. I hoped things would be different now. I hoped. But hope isn't a system. It isn't a protocol. It isn't training. The camera was still there, and as strange as it felt to admit, that mattered more. Time didn't soften the memory the way I expected. It didn't fade into something distant or abstract. Instead, it settled into me quietly, becoming part of how I moved through the world afterward. I became more careful, not just with my blood sugar, but with people, with situations, with how quickly trust can evaporate when discomfort enters the room. I started noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. The way security guards watch certain customers longer than others. The way impatience turns into suspicion the moment someone disrupts a routine. The way rules are enforced selectively, depending on who looks confident and who looks unsteady. None of that was new. I just couldn't unsee it anymore. The messages kept coming. Not constantly, not in waves like before, but steadily, quietly. Each one a reminder that what happened to me was part of a much larger pattern. People wrote about being stopped, questioned, mocked, removed, restrained, all because their bodies didn't behave in ways that looked acceptable to strangers. The details changed. The outcome varied. The disbelief was always the same. One message stayed with me more than the others. It was short. I never say anything anymore. I just let it happen. That sentence sat heavy in my chest. I understood it instantly. There's a moment, after enough experiences like mine, where you stop explaining. You stop asking for understanding. You decide it's safer to endure quietly than to risk being accused of lying. Silence becomes a survival strategy. That's the real cost of disbelief. It doesn't just hurt you once. It trains you to disappear. I thought about the camera again, about how it hadn't protected me until someone chose to look at it, about how many people don't have that option. No footage, no proof, just their word against someone else's certainty. Proof shouldn't be a prerequisite for compassion. But the world doesn't work that way. A month later, I received another email. This one wasn't from the store. It was from a local advocacy group I'd never heard of. They'd seen the footage. They wanted to know if I'd be willing to speak, anonymously, about invisible medical conditions and public response. I hesitated. I wasn't looking to become a spokesperson. I didn't want attention. I didn't want my life to orbit around one moment of vulnerability. But I kept thinking about that message. I never say anything anymore. I agreed, with conditions. No face, no name, no dramatization, just facts. The interview was simple. A voice recording, no camera, no audience, just questions and answers. They asked what hypoglycemia feels like. They asked what it's like to lose control of your body in public. They asked what hurt the most. I surprised myself with my answer. It wasn't the accusation, I said. It was how easy it was for them to believe it. That clip circulated quietly. Not viral, not explosive, but it reached the right people. Medical professionals, educators, security trainers, people whose decisions matter when someone's standing in front of them, shaking, struggling, asking to be believed. I didn't follow its reach closely. I didn't want to. I'd learned what happens when you tie your sense of safety to public reaction. Life continued. I returned to routines, work, errands, appointments, the ordinary scaffolding of existence. But the awareness never left. Every time I felt my blood sugar dip, even slightly, my chest tightened. Not from fear of the symptoms, but from fear of the response, of having to justify myself again. I prepared more, carried glucose everywhere, wore a medical bracelet I'd avoided before because I didn't want questions. I accepted that invisibility is a double-edged thing. It keeps you from being defined by your condition, but it also leaves you unprotected when things go wrong. One afternoon, months later, I was in another store, different chain, different layout, same fluorescent lights, same checkout line. The register froze again. My heart skipped, not physically, but emotionally. I checked my body immediately. I was fine, stable, no symptoms. But the memory surged forward anyway, vivid and uninvited. The woman in front of me turned around and sighed loudly. "Every time," she muttered. I tensed without realizing it. Nothing happened. The register rebooted. The line moved. No accusations, no confrontation, no cameras needed. I exhaled slowly, surprised by how much tension I'd been holding. That's the thing about moments like mine. They don't end when the situation resolves. They echo. They shape how you anticipate the world. I thought again about the woman who'd accused me, about her message. You didn't have to ruin my life. I wondered what version of events she told herself now, whether she'd learned anything at all, or whether she still believed she was the victim of an overreaction rather than the cause of one. Some people don't change. They just get quieter. But systems can change. Procedures can change. Awareness can change. And sometimes a single camera pointed in the right direction can shift a balance of power that usually goes unquestioned. I never wanted that footage to exist. I never wanted proof. I just wanted sugar. I just wanted help. I just wanted to be believed. But once the proof existed, it did more than clear my name. It forced people to look at something they'd rather ignore. That's the uncomfortable truth about invisible conditions. They demand trust in a world built on suspicion, and every time trust fails, someone pays the price. What stayed with me wasn't the argument or even the accusation. It was the speed. The speed with which a normal moment turned hostile. The speed with which strangers formed a consensus about who I was. The speed with which doubt replaced empathy. That kind of speed doesn't come from logic. It comes from habit. From a society trained to resolve discomfort by assigning blame as quickly as possible. After everything's settled, after the emails stopped and the messages slowed to a trickle, I started thinking less about the store and more about the pattern, about how predictable it all had been, once I stepped back and stripped away the shock. The register froze. I faltered. Someone decided I was a problem. Authority aligned with certainty, not vulnerability. Proof came last. It always does. I began replaying other moments in my life through that lens. Times when I'd felt pressured to perform wellness so people wouldn't question me. Times when I'd hidden symptoms because explaining them felt more dangerous than enduring them. Times when I'd felt relief simply because nothing went wrong in public that day. That realization was unsettling. It meant I hadn't been unlucky. I'd been living inside a system that works exactly like this most of the time, without incident. Until it doesn't. I thought about how often people say, "I would have helped." How easy that sentence is to say when you're not the one in the moment. When you're not the one whose hands are shaking, whose speech is slowing, whose body is betraying them under the scrutiny of strangers. Helping feels obvious from a distance. In reality, people follow cues. And the loudest cue in that checkout line wasn't my distress. It was her confidence. Confidence is persuasive. More persuasive than truth. More persuasive than evidence, especially in public spaces where authority and order are prized above nuance. She didn't need facts. She needed conviction. And that conviction filled the vacuum where understanding should have been. Once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it anywhere else. On public transport, when someone sat down suddenly and people stared instead of asking if they were okay. At work, when someone took a break and whispers followed. Online, where clips without context outran explanations every time. The same mechanism repeated itself. Discomfort, suspicion, certainty, judgment. The camera in the store hadn't changed human nature. It had just interrupted the sequence long enough for the truth to surface. I started reading more about invisible conditions, not medically but socially. How they're perceived, how often they're dismissed, how frequently people are accused of exaggeration, manipulation, or outright lying. The stories were depressingly consistent. Different countries, different settings, same outcome. Believe the confident accuser. Question the struggling person. What disturbed me most was how often the accused internalized it. How many people described apologizing for symptoms they couldn't control? How many felt embarrassed for needing help? How many stopped asking altogether? That's how harm compounds, not in dramatic confrontations, but in quiet decisions to disappear a little more each time. One evening, while scrolling through messages, I came across one that didn't ask anything of me. It didn't seek validation or advice. It simply said, "I saw the video. Next time I see someone shaking in line, I'll ask if they need help instead of assuming." I sat with that for a long time. Not because it erased what happened, but because it suggested something rare, a changed reflex, a pause inserted where judgment used to be automatic. That pause mattered more than outrage, more than apologies, more than consequences. Because the real danger isn't one woman in one store. It's a reflex shared by millions of people who've never been taught to question it. I wondered how many times I'd been part of that reflex myself before this happened. How many moments I'd witnessed discomfort and chosen distance over engagement because it felt safer, because it was easier to look away than to risk being wrong. That thought humbled me. It stripped away any illusion that this was a story about good people and bad people. It was about systems and habits and fear of uncertainty, and how quickly fear turns into accusation when no better framework exists. Weeks passed. Life regained its rhythm. But something subtle had changed in me. I paid closer attention. I listened more carefully. When someone stumbled over words or seemed disoriented, I didn't rush to explain it away. I waited. I asked. I learned to sit with ambiguity instead of rushing to resolve it. That wasn't altruism. It was survival. I understood now how fragile dignity is when your body doesn't behave on command. One afternoon, I was in a cafe when a man at the counter dropped his wallet. His hands shook as he tried to pick it up. Someone behind him sighed impatiently. The barista frowned. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, not from hypoglycemia, but from recognition. I stepped forward and said quietly, "Do you need a moment?" He looked up, startled, then relieved. "Yeah," he said. "Thanks." That was it. No accusation. No spectacle. No escalation. Just a moment interrupted in the right direction. It struck me then how small the intervention had been, and how large its impact. How easily my own experience could have ended differently if someone had done the same for me before certainty took over. The camera had forced the truth into the open. But cameras can't be everywhere. They can't replace human judgment. They can't substitute for empathy. They can only correct after harm has already occurred. That's the uncomfortable part no one likes to talk about. Proof comes late. Accountability comes later. And by the time they arrive, damage has already been done. I thought again about the woman's message, about her framing of events. You didn't have to ruin my life. I realized then that she genuinely believed that in her mind, consequences were an attack, not a response, that the truth felt like punishment because it removed her ability to control the narrative. There are a lot of people like that. People who see accountability as injustice and discomfort as oppression. People who mistake being questioned for being harmed. They thrive in systems that reward confidence over care. I didn't respond to her because there was nothing to explain. Explanation requires a shared reality. We didn't have one. Instead, I focused on the reality I could influence, the conversations I could shift, the pauses I could introduce, the assumptions I could challenge by not repeating them. Invisible conditions don't ask for special treatment. They ask for patience, for time, for the benefit of the doubt in moments when doubt is the easiest response. That's not a radical demand. It's a human one. The checkout line incident had shown me how quickly things can go wrong. The aftermath showed me how slowly trust is rebuilt. And the months that followed taught me something else entirely. That prevention doesn't look dramatic. It looks boring. It looks like someone choosing not to jump to conclusions. Like someone asking a question instead of making an accusation. Like someone recognizing that not everything real is visible. I never wanted to be an example. But examples don't volunteer. They happen when systems fail loudly enough that people are forced to look. If there's one thing I carry forward from all of this, it's this. Disbelief is a choice. So is restraint. So is compassion. And in public spaces, those choices matter more than rules ever will. After everything, I stopped thinking of that day as an incident. It became a reference point, a before and after. Not because it was extraordinary, but because it stripped away illusions I didn't even know I still had. The illusion that people default to kindness. The illusion that rules exist to protect rather than control. The illusion that truth naturally rises to the surface if you're patient enough. Truth doesn't rise. It has to be dragged up, usually after damage has already been done. I began to notice how often people confuse calm with credibility, how a steady voice is trusted more than an accurate one, how confidence functions as a substitute for evidence in everyday life. The woman at the checkout hadn't been right, but she'd been certain, and that certainty carried weight. I hadn't been convincing, but I had been honest, and honesty without polish rarely survives public scrutiny. That realization followed me everywhere. At work, I saw how quickly opinions formed in meetings before all information was available. On social media, I watched partial clips spark outrage while full explanations were ignored. In casual conversations, I noticed how often phrases like, "that doesn't sound right," replaced actual inquiry. People weren't malicious most of the time. They were efficient, and efficiency favors shortcuts. Invisible conditions break those shortcuts. They don't present clean signals. They don't align with expectations. They demand patience in environments designed to move quickly and decisively. And when patience is treated as weakness, disbelief fills the gap. I started thinking about how much effort goes into appearing normal, the constant calculations, the preemptive adjustments, eating at certain times, carrying supplies, avoiding situations where symptoms might appear inconvenient or suspicious. None of that is visible, none of it earns credit. But the moment something slips, all of it is erased. You're no longer a person managing a condition, you're a disruption. That framing is dangerous. It allows systems to treat vulnerability as misconduct. It justifies escalation under the guise of order. It transforms assistance into permission, and permission into leverage. I thought again about the security guard, not with anger, but with clarity. He hadn't been cruel. He'd been procedural. He'd followed the path laid out in front of him: theft protocol, authority hierarchy, risk mitigation. At no point had he been trained to recognize the absence of certainty as a signal to slow down rather than clamp down. That's how systems fail, not through villains but through momentum. The store's new policies were a step. Training helps, awareness helps, but no policy can account for every human variable. No training can override instinct unless that instinct is challenged repeatedly. That's where culture matters. Not corporate statements, not apologies. Culture. I noticed subtle shifts after the footage circulated. Not dramatic changes, but small hesitations. People pausing before commenting, asking follow-up questions, referencing the video when similar situations came up. "Remember that checkout incident?" they'd say. Turns out there was more to it. More to it. That phrase became important to me. It acknowledged complexity without demanding mastery. It created space for uncertainty without turning it into accusation. I wondered how many lives are shaped by moments where that space never appears, where the first interpretation becomes the final verdict, where no camera intervenes, where no second look is taken. I thought about the times I'd been spared simply because nothing went wrong in public, how fragile that safety really is, how dependent it is on timing, environment, and the goodwill of strangers who don't know you. There's a particular exhaustion that comes from knowing you're always one misstep away from disbelief. Not dramatic exhaustion, not burnout. A low-level vigilance that never fully shuts off. It shapes decisions. It narrows possibilities. It teaches you to minimize yourself. That vigilance is invisible, too. Months later, someone asked me if I regretted sharing the footage, if I wished I'd kept it private. The question caught me off guard. I thought about it carefully before answering. "No," I said, "but I regret that it was necessary." Because that's the core of it. The problem wasn't that proof existed. It was that proof was required. That belief was conditional. That dignity had to be earned, retroactively. People like to believe they're fair-minded, that they wait for evidence, that they don't jump to conclusions. but fairness is often applied selectively after the fact when it's comfortable. In the moment, instinct rules, and instinct is shaped by stories we tell ourselves about who lies, who cheats, who exaggerates, who deserves patience. Those stories are rarely examined. I began to think of the checkout camera not as a witness, but as a disruptor. It disrupted the default narrative. It interrupted the flow of assumption. It forced a pause in a system that doesn't naturally pause. That's why it felt powerful, not because it punished anyone, but because it slowed things down long enough for truth to be seen. Slowness is underrated. Slowness allows context. It allows doubt to exist without turning into accusation. It allows help to precede judgment. But slowness is hard to maintain in public spaces built around efficiency and control. Lines must move. Rules must be enforced. Disruptions must be resolved quickly. There isn't time, supposedly, to sort through ambiguity. Except there is. There always is. We just choose not to use it. I thought about how easily my situation could have escalated further. How close I'd been to being removed from the store. How quickly escort her out could have become call the police. How fragile that boundary really was. All because someone decided disbelief was safer than curiosity. That thought lingered longer than anything else, because once authority is invoked, momentum accelerates. The cost of reversing course grows. Admitting error becomes harder. Doubt is perceived as weakness, and the person at the center of it all loses agency entirely. I was lucky. Luckier than most. There was a camera. There was a manager willing to look. There was footage clear enough to override narrative. Luck shouldn't be a requirement. I didn't come away from this with optimism. I came away with clarity. Systems won't change overnight. Instincts won't reverse themselves without effort. Invisible conditions will remain invisible, by definition. But awareness can widen the gap between uncertainty and accusation. And sometimes, that gap is enough to prevent harm. That's what I hold on to now. Not hope, not faith in institutions. Just the idea that hesitation, introduced at the right moment, can save someone from becoming a story they never agreed to be part of. Because once a story takes hold, it's hard to rewrite. And the most dangerous stories are the ones told with confidence and no curiosity at all. There's a quiet violence in being reduced to a suspicion. It doesn't leave bruises. It doesn't trigger alarms. It doesn't look like harm from the outside. But it rewrites how you understand your place in public spaces. It teaches you that your safety depends not on what's happening to you, but on how convincingly you can explain it while it's happening. And when your body is failing, explanation becomes a luxury you don't have. After the checkout incident, I became acutely aware of how often society asks people to justify their suffering in real time. Not afterward, when things are calm and language returns, but in the middle of it, when hands shake, when words fragment, when thought itself slows down. That demand is quietly cruel, because it favors those who are least affected and penalizes those who need understanding the most. I started noticing how many systems are built on the assumption of bad faith, theft prevention, fraud detection, policy enforcement. Each one begins with the premise that someone is trying to cheat the system. That premise doesn't stay contained. It bleeds outward. It shapes how employees are trained, how authority responds, how bystanders interpret ambiguity. Suspicion becomes the default lens. In that checkout line, suspicion moved faster than concern. It moved faster than curiosity, faster than caution. It didn't need evidence. It didn't need context. It just needed a disruption and someone confident enough to label it. Confidence is contagious. It creates momentum, and momentum is hard to stop once it starts rolling. I thought about how differently things might have gone if the woman behind me had hesitated for just a second, if she had asked a question instead of making a declaration, if she had said, "Are you okay?" instead of, "I don't believe you." That single sentence changed the trajectory of everything that followed. It transformed uncertainty into accusation and invited authority to respond accordingly. People underestimate how powerful those first words are. They frame the situation before anyone else has time to observe. They establish the story that others unconsciously align with. Once that alignment happens, reversing it feels like disruption, not correction. That's why proof had to be overwhelming, not partial, not suggestive, overwhelming, enough to break momentum. And even then, it didn't erase what had already happened. I carried that awareness with me into every interaction afterward. Not paranoia, exactly. More like calibration. I watched how quickly people sided with whoever spoke first and loudest. I noticed how often vulnerability was treated as inconvenience. I paid attention to which behaviors triggered empathy and which triggered enforcement. The pattern was consistent. Calm equals credible. Distress equals suspect. That realization is deeply unsettling when you live with a condition that produces visible distress without visible explanation. It means you are always one bad moment away from being misunderstood, one delay, one interruption, one failure to perform composure convincingly enough. I thought about how often people talk about resilience, about handling things better, about staying calm under pressure. Those phrases sound neutral, even encouraging, until you realize how often they're used to shift responsibility onto the person least equipped to carry it in that moment. Stay calm, explain yourself, follow the rules, all reasonable requests, unless your nervous system is misfiring, your blood sugar is crashing, or your brain is struggling to process language. Then they become barriers disguised as expectations. I began to understand why so many people with invisible conditions withdraw, why they avoid public spaces when symptoms might appear, why they downplay, delay, or deny their own needs. It's not denial, it's risk management. It's the calculation that being uncomfortable privately is safer than being disbelieved publicly. That calculation has consequences. It isolates people. It reinforces silence. It creates a feedback loop where invisibility becomes both shield and trap. I thought again about the online comments, about how quickly strangers had filled in gaps with assumptions, about how comfortable they'd been deciding who I was based on a few seconds of footage. That comfort came from distance, from anonymity, from the absence of accountability. But it also came from familiarity. They'd seen similar clips before. They'd absorbed narratives about scammers and fakers and attention seekers. Those narratives made my situation legible to them without effort. That's how stereotypes function. They reduce complexity into something manageable, something predictable, something that doesn't require engagement. The full footage disrupted that reduction. It complicated the story, and complexity is uncomfortable. It forces people to slow down, to reconsider, to admit uncertainty. Many resist that instinctively. I noticed which comments disappeared after the full video was shared. Not because they were deleted, but because the people behind them went silent. Silence can mean many things. Sometimes it's reflection. Sometimes it's embarrassment. Sometimes it's retreat. I didn't need apologies from them. What mattered was the interruption, the pause where certainty used to be. That pause is rare. In public conflicts, speed is rewarded. The faster you label, the faster you feel resolved. Slowing down feels risky. It opens space for doubt. It threatens authority. It invites questions that don't have easy answers. But slowness is often where truth lives. I thought about the manager's response when I asked what would have happened without the camera. "I don't know," he'd said. That answer stayed with me. It acknowledged uncertainty without defensiveness. It admitted that systems don't always default to fairness, that outcomes are contingent, not guaranteed, That honesty mattered because it didn't pretend the system was better than it was. I began to see my experience less as a personal ordeal and more as a case study, not in a detached way, but in a clarifying one. It revealed fault lines that exist everywhere, waiting for the right conditions to surface. Those fault lines don't discriminate. They catch people with disabilities, chronic illnesses, mental health conditions, neurological differences, anyone whose experience doesn't match visual expectations, anyone whose distress doesn't fit familiar templates. The camera didn't create accountability, it exposed its absence. That distinction is important. Accountability didn't exist until proof forced it into being. Until then, the system functioned exactly as designed. I wondered how many other incidents ended differently because proof never arrived. How many people were removed, arrested, banned, shamed, or harmed because disbelief went unchallenged. How many stories never surfaced because silence felt safer than speaking? That thought made it impossible to see my experience as isolated or exceptional. It also made it impossible to forget. I didn't become an activist. I didn't campaign. I didn't seek a platform. I simply carried the knowledge forward, quietly, deliberately. I let it inform how I interpreted situations, how I responded to ambiguity, how I resisted the urge to fill gaps with assumptions. That resistance became a kind of discipline, one that required effort, one that went against instinct, but one that felt necessary, because instinct, left unexamined, had nearly cost me far more than dignity. The most dangerous part of that day wasn't the accusation. It was the moment when authority aligned with certainty instead of care, when procedure outweighed perception, when removal became a viable option simply because someone said the word steal with enough confidence. That alignment happens every day, everywhere, usually quietly, usually without cameras. Remembering that keeps me alert, not fearful, alert. Alert to how quickly roles are assigned, how easily narratives solidify, how fast someone can go from customer to suspect, from person to problem. The camera changed the outcome, but it didn't change the system, and systems don't change unless people learn to pause where they once rushed. That pause, fragile, uncomfortable, deliberate, is where everything hinges. There's a moment after. Something like this happens when you realize the world didn't actually pause for you. It felt enormous from the inside, like everything had tilted around that checkout counter, but outside of it, people kept moving. The store reopened the next morning. The register that froze was fixed. The camera kept recording. The routine absorbed the disruption and continued as if nothing fundamental had been exposed. That contrast stayed with me. How something that reshapes your understanding of safety can register as a minor incident to the system that produced it. I started paying attention to how institutions frame harm, not as experience, but as deviation, something that interrupted normal operations, something to be corrected, documented, and closed. The goal wasn't understanding, it was restoration of order. Once order returned, the incident was considered resolved. But harm doesn't resolve on a schedule. For the person at the center of it, the impact continues in quiet, cumulative ways. It shows up in hesitation, in avoidance, in the calculation you do before entering spaces where you might need help from strangers. It shows up in the mental rehearsal of explanations you hope you won't need, and the contingency plans you carry just in case belief fails again. That's not paranoia. It's adaptation. I realized how often people mistake adaptation for weakness, how they assume that if you prepare, you must be exaggerating. If you anticipate disbelief, you must be manipulative. There's a deep misunderstanding there, one that punishes foresight and rewards obliviousness. People who never need accommodations are rarely asked to justify their lack of preparation. People who do are constantly scrutinized. After the incident, I began noticing how language is used to police credibility. Words like claim, allege, supposedly, subtle qualifiers that create distance between a person and their experience. In contrast, accusations are often stated plainly, without qualifiers. She stole. He lied. They faked it. Certainty is granted to the accuser, skepticism to the person affected. That asymmetry isn't accidental. It reflects power. Accusations align with control. Explanations challenge it. I thought again about how quickly authority had shifted toward removal, how close I'd come to being escorted out, not because I'd done something wrong, but because I couldn't convincingly prove I hadn't. That inversion of responsibility is one of the most dangerous features of public enforcement. It assumes innocence is something you perform, not something you possess. And performance requires capacity. When your body is failing, capacity disappears first. That's why the expectation to explain yourself during a medical episode is so unreasonable. It asks the impossible at the worst possible moment. It demands coherence from someone whose system is actively losing it. It prioritizes order over care and calls it fairness. I started wondering how many rules function that way. Reasonable on paper, harmful in practice, neutral in design, biased in effect. Rules are written for the average case. Invisible conditions live outside averages. That mismatch creates friction, and friction produces heat. In public spaces, that heat is often directed at the person who disrupted the flow, not the system that failed to accommodate them. I remembered the moment when someone suggested checking the cameras. How that single suggestion shifted everything. It wasn't loud. It wasn't authoritative. It was cautious. Just to be safe. Those words mattered. They didn't accuse anyone of being wrong. They simply opened the door to verification. Verification should not require crisis, but it often does. I thought about how much trust we place in recording devices now, how cameras have become arbiters of truth in disputes where human testimony is discounted. There's something unsettling about that reliance. Not because cameras are inaccurate, but because belief has become conditional on documentation. What happens to people whose lives aren't constantly recorded? Whose moments of vulnerability occur out of frame? Whose truth exists only in memory and sensation? They are left to negotiate disbelief alone. I didn't come away from this with blind faith in cameras. I came away with skepticism about why they're needed in the first place, why a person's word carries so little weight when it conflicts with suspicion, why systems designed to serve the public default to control instead of care when ambiguity arises. Ambiguity is treated as threat. That framing encourages escalation. It rewards decisiveness even when decisiveness is wrong. It penalizes hesitation even when hesitation would prevent harm. I noticed how often people praise taking action without questioning what that action is. Calling security, enforcing policy, removing the problem. Action feels responsible. It feels proactive. It feels safe. Sometimes it's none of those things. Sometimes the safest action is to slow down, to ask a question, to wait 30 seconds before turning uncertainty into accusation. But slowness is rarely incentivized. It doesn't look productive. It doesn't create the appearance of control. And appearances matter more than outcomes in many systems. The woman at the checkout had taken action. She'd identified a problem and escalated it. From a certain perspective, she'd done exactly what people are encouraged to do. Speak up. Don't ignore suspicious behavior. Protect the rules. The flaw wasn't her willingness to act. It was her unwillingness to question her own interpretation. That's where harm enters. I began to think about how often moral certainty substitutes for understanding, how people use it to shield themselves from complexity. If you're sure you're right, you don't have to listen. You don't have to learn. You don't have to risk being wrong. Moral certainty is comfortable. Empathy is not. Empathy requires exposure to uncertainty. It requires the humility to admit you might not know what's happening. It requires patience when patience feels inconvenient. Those qualities aren't cultivated by most systems. They're often actively discouraged. I realized that what I wanted most after the incident wasn't punishment or vindication. It was acknowledgement. Not just that I'd been wronged, but that the situation itself had been mishandled. That the default response had failed. That disbelief had caused harm. That acknowledgement came partially, unevenly, and late. Late acknowledgement still matters, but early belief matters more. I thought about how often people say, "I believe you," as a gesture of solidarity. In my experience, belief is rarely a declaration. It's a behavior. It shows up in how quickly someone offers help instead of scrutiny, in whether they escalate or de-escalate, in whether they prioritize safety over suspicion. Belief isn't passive, it's active restraint. Restraint from accusing, restraint from assuming. Restraint from treating distress as disruption. That restraint was absent in the checkout line. It only appeared once proof forced it into existence. I wondered how we might train for restraint instead of reaction. How we might design systems that treat uncertainty as a signal to slow down rather than clamp down. How we might normalize saying, "I don't know," instead of filling the gap with judgment. Those questions don't have easy answers. They don't fit neatly into policies or procedures, but they matter more than any rule book. I thought again about the phrase, invisible but real. How invisibility invites disbelief. How reality persists regardless. How the tension between those two facts creates harm when belief becomes conditional. Living with an invisible condition means constantly navigating that tension. You're real, but your experience isn't immediately legible. You exist, but you require trust. And trust is often rationed. The checkout incident exposed that reality in the most public way possible. It forced it into the open. It made it undeniable. But it didn't solve it. What it did was leave me with a responsibility I didn't ask for, but couldn't ignore. To remember, to notice, to interrupt the reflex where I could, to refuse certainty when certainty isn't warranted. That responsibility isn't heroic. It's heavy. It's tiring. It's often thankless. But it feels necessary. Because the next time someone's hands shake in a checkout line, or their words slow, or their balance falters, the story doesn't have to unfold the same way. Not if someone chooses a different first sentence. Not if someone chooses to wait instead of accuse. Those choices don't require cameras. They require restraint. And restraint, unlike certainty, is something we can practice.